Having looked at the UK's influence in the EU institutions, let's turn our attention now to the special arrangements that apply in certain issue areas. As we can see from this image, which comes from the leaflet produced by the government that is being sent to all households in the UK government's pro-EU message begins by reassuring voters that the UK has, in the words of the leaflet here at the top of this image, secured a special status in a reformed EU. This is a reference to David Cameron's renegotiation, which was decided by EU leaders in February 2016, and it's on the basis of this renegotiation that the government is asking voters to vote to remain in the EU. Let's explore this slogan about a special status further. It's certainly correct to say that the UK's position in the EU is unique. Why do I say that? Well, for one thing, since 1984, the UK has a permanent budget rebate, which means the cost of being in the EU is much lower than if the UK were treated as any other member state is. There are also legally binding agreements called opt-outs that prevent the UK from being obliged to join the euro or participate in Schengen, the border-free travel area, and its associated provisions on asylum policy. Note, these are the first 2 points on this image. Taken together, those are really significant concessions obtained by previous governments that the UK cannot be forced to relinquish, except voluntarily. What's also interesting about these opt-outs is they illustrate what is and is not possible when it comes to retaining sovereignty within the EU. Most importantly, there's no question at all of being able to opt out from single market rules if outvoted. And we know that possibility exists. But EU law is supreme in this area, and the ultimate arbiter of compliance is the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. Now that places important restrictions on UK sovereignty now and in the future, and the Leave camp is right to point those out. But I'm going to explore much more about those restrictions relating to the single market when I turn to that theme in next week's lecture. But in the campaign claims we saw earlier, remember that the Leave campaign was also saying that the Eurozone is a bloc that can outvote the UK, and that therefore there might be costs to UK taxpayers to bail out governments that use the euro. The problem with the first claim here is that the Eurozone, according to data that I'm going to show you, is not a coherent voting bloc. This is quite clear when we look at which countries vote in the same way as the United Kingdom in the EU Council. So here's another figure compiled in the VoteWatch Europe report on Brexit. What does it show us? It shows us that there are 13 countries that share the UK's perspective on EU laws 87% or more of the time. So that goes from Sweden on the very left of this chart to Slovakia towards the middle. So that's 13 countries, of which 11 use the euro. There's nothing to stop the Eurozone countries trying to coordinate their preferences. Indeed, they're supposed to coordinate their budgets and implement economic reforms agreed together. But the opt-out from the single currency means that none of this applies to the UK. In fact, the agreement negotiated by David Cameron in February 2016 contains important provisions to shield the UK from any discrimination by Eurozone countries. In essence, in that February agreement, EU leaders agreed to change EU law to ensure that countries not using the euro or participating in the new banking union can keep their own rules for supervision of the financial sector. That's already one major change. The other major change is that they agreed that countries outside the eurozone will not be obliged to contribute to bailouts. Here's the official language used in that agreement on page 14 of what are called the conclusions from the European Council. So here's the key quote, Annex 1, Section A, Paragraph 3. Emergency and crisis measures designed to safeguard the financial stability of the euro area will not entail budgetary responsibility for member states whose currency is not the euro. Thus, the second big claim of the Leave campaign about the risks of being tied to the eurozone is not valid. The text of the February agreement is provided below, alongside links to expert analysis going into more depth over what it really means, should you be interested. Because in the next and final part, I'm going to explore what the UK, despite its special status, is supposed to achieve by pooling sovereignty with the EU, because of course that argument is a big part of the Remain campaign.